Kimi Antonelli is officially a Grand Prix winner, F1 the movie is officially an Oscar-winning film, and Esteban Ocon officially has better playlist taste than Ollie Behrman. Welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are going to be going through the Chinese Grand Prix. We're not going to go through the race turn by turn, but we will talk about some of the biggest moments and what they mean for the rest of the season, as well as some of the biggest news stories that came out of this race week. And of course, one of our biggest race stories today will be about Kimi Antonelli and the future of youth in this sport. Whether or not this was the right decision, whether or not he was moved too quickly, and whether or not he can really win a World Drivers' Championship at just 19 years old. And our main story that comes out of this weekend, out of this Chinese Grand Prix, is really Ferrari, Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, and whether or not Formula One really truly functions as a team sport or an individual one. If you're new to the show, welcome, and of course, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening right now. And if you haven't joined our Discord server, in order to be able to watch the race alongside other fans just like yourself, be sure to join that by clicking the link in the episode description down below. Now, the Chinese Grand Prix was only our second race of the season, but it was also our first sprint race weekend of the season, and came with, yet again, a lot of chaos. As we are in a new series of regulations, we are also, of course, going to expect a level of unreliability when it comes to these cars. However, the chaos that we have seen over the last 2 weekends is maybe even more than we were expecting. Before we even get into anything that happened on track, there was quite a lot that happened off track that was worth talking about. One of the things that we discovered last week is one of the aspects of Apple taking over the F1 streaming rights in the United States is that we're also getting Formula One highlighted across a number of Apple channels in the ecosystem. And one of the things that we discovered last week is that there is a new playlist inside Apple Music that's highlighting the driver's personal warm-up playlist. Last week, we went through Ollie Behrman's because he was the driver who was featured for that race. And if you remember, the playlist was full of pop ballads that also lacked flow. It was chaotically organized and it was absolutely made to be put on shuffle. There was a lot of Taylor Swift, there was some Lionel Richie, there was a lot going on there. And I will say that while I personally have very strong feelings about a way a playlist should be organized, and I will not be changing them, a lot of you actually felt kind of seen by Ollie Behrman's playlist and the way that he organized it. I received a lot of messages saying that you personally feel that playlists should be put on shuffle no matter what. And to that I say, you are wrong, but I think it's okay. You can do whatever you like. However, Esteban Ocon was the driver who was featured this week. And because of popular demand, I will be reviewing these playlists every single race week at the beginning of these episodes. And if we were doing this sort of like King of the Hill style, Esteban Ocon absolutely knocks Ollie Behrman out of the chair for his playlist flow this week. And part of the reasoning for that is probably that Esteban actually feels like music is a big part of his warm-up process. If you ever look at one of these featured playlists, you'll see that the drivers do a short interview, kind of similar to the way that they see like Zane Lowe when he does a new album drop. So Esteban's reads like this: I always listen to music in my room while I warm up before getting in the car, Esteban Ocon tells Apple Music. It has become a part of my routine. It gets me pumped and ready for the fight. And I will tell you, I actually really like this playlist, so I'm playing favorites here. I genuinely believe that if you walked into Haas and you were near Esteban's driver room before they actually got on track, you would hear this playlist bumping. And if you also are the type of person that needs to be like hyped before going, this playlist will help. The French driver previously competed for Force India and Alpine, formerly Renault, and got his first race win with the latter in 2021 before signing with Haas in 2025. To celebrate his second year with the team, he's created a playlist to showcase the music that gets him in race mode and more favorite recent listens. I have very mixed taste in music, he says. I like to be able to listen to very different genres from different eras and in different languages too. It shows with recent and classic picks spanning hip-hop, R&B, pop, rock, and beyond. Lately, I've been really enjoying some French rap and some of Hans Zimmer's music soundtracks. I also love 2000s pop music. The music was so good back then. Yes, it was, and we actually, I think, are losing the recipes, but that's neither here nor there. Ocon highlights A Dark Knight from the soundtrack to Christopher Nolan's 2008 Batman film, The Dark Knight. I love Hans Zimmer, and I think his music brings so much to the movies, he says. The Dark Knight is one of my all-time favorite movies, and when I hear this song, it really gets me pumped and ready to tackle a challenge. So I will say, before we go through the playlist, the Dark Knight portion of it really was exciting to me because I personally love the Dark Knight soundtracks. The Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy is not only one of my favorite Batman takes, but it also has some of my favorite movie soundtracks, and the music that was written by Hans Zimmer is kind of like some of the best productivity music that you can listen to. I use those soundtracks a lot to write. I use them to kind of be productive when I'm doing work and I don't want to have kind of lyrics in my music. And also, I just love those movies. They're such like an immersive soundtrack as well. When you play them, you feel like you're completely locked in. And so I do want to point out that, again, I actually think that this playlist situation is one of the coolest ways that we're going to be able to connect with drivers on a personal level in a way that I don't think Formula One has always made an effort to do. When you are trying to create a new fan base or get someone into a new sport, the best way to do that is to create a personal connection with one of the athletes, which then makes you as a viewer really care about that person. Formula One as a sport didn't really start doing that until Drive to Survive Survive happened. And once Drive to Survive did happen, that still had this element of kind of narrative being formed by a producer or by another group of people that were forming that television show. Little things like this with the Apple partnership, as small as they are, these small little playlists, are really a personal touch that allows you to have these little moments where you think like, oh, I have something in common with a Formula One driver. Do Esteban Ocon and I have like any sort of similar life? No, not at all. But we do have one really specific similar taste in music that I think now I care a little bit more about him. I really think that this is such a fun way to connect with the drivers and to get to know their personalities in a different way. And it genuinely is one of my favorite parts to come out of this Apple partnership so far, which is why I'm having fun kind of breaking these down and going through them, even though they are not about the race itself. So getting into the music and the playlist itself, this playlist is genuinely like all bangers. And the flow is incredible. We start out so strong with Ride With Me by Nelly, and then we jump straight into Low by Flo Rida. Then we do get to my first skip of the playlist, which is Take Care by Drake, but then we jump right back in with Temperature by Sean Paul. After that, we've got Lean Back, Terror Squad, Fat Joe, and Remy, Always on Time with Ja Rule, Promiscuous by Nelly Furtado, All the Stars from the Black Panther playlist, Act a Fool by Ludacris from the Too Fast, Too Furious soundtrack, which also at this point now I'm like, should Esteban Ocon and I talk about movies? I got some questions, man. I think we have a lot of really similar taste. And if you haven't watched Too Fast, Too Furious, boy, are you missing out on a cinematic masterpiece. A couple of other really great songs. I'm going out of order now just to highlight, to not go through the entirety of the playlist. We've got September by Earth, Wind and Fire, Viva La Vida by Coldplay, and I know what you're thinking, Viva La Vida by Coldplay, it's a banger song, okay? It got so popular to hate Coldplay that we continue to forget that they have some really fun songs. They have good music. And the playlist actually rounds out with two different Hans Zimmer songs. We have Lost But One, which is from the Rush soundtrack, and A Dark Knight, which is also from the Dark Knight soundtrack. Now, the cool thing about this playlist is I actually feel like more so than with Ollie Behrman, I know a ton about Esteban Ocon now. I know what kind of movies he watches. I know that he's a soundtrack geek. I also know that what gets him hyped is like the same type of music that you want to hear on the dance floor on a night out. It is bangers, it is throwbacks, and it is a good hype playlist. And of course, as we know, what's very important to me, there is a flow, there is a craft, there's a reason all of these songs happen in the order that they happen. The playlist takes you on an emotional journey, and now we know what journey Esteban takes before he gets into the car and starts a Grand Prix. And yes, King of the Hill style, he absolutely knocks Ollie Behrman off, and we'll have to see which driver comes in next week, but I am definitely going to have a lot of fun this season going through everybody's music taste and deciding whether or not we would be best friends or mortal enemies. Esteban Ocon has officially been marked in the best friend category. And speaking of movies, of course we have to talk about the fact that F1 the movie is officially an Oscar-winning film. The movie itself was nominated for 4 different Oscars, including Best Picture, and it came away with 1 win, which I actually think was a deserved one, which was under Best Sound. Now, I know that a lot of Formula One fans are very conflicted about this movie, but I personally think it was good for the sport and also that the film was pretty fun. In my experience, just kind of going through life since the F1 movie has come out, a lot of people that I've met have told me that F1 the movie was the reason they started watching F1, the reason they found out that F1 existed, and the reason that they got interested in the sport as a whole. While I don't think that it was a perfect film, I do think there were a lot of technical aspects of this movie that were really great, both for the film itself and also for the industry as a whole. So much of this movie was filmed practically, which is something that we don't do a ton of anymore in this industry. And the movie in some ways had some really well done sequences that made you feel like you were physically in a Formula One car, which is something that most of us will never get to do. The feeling of those race sequences, the sound design that is now Oscar winning, and the way that the film was shot as a whole brought a lot of people into this sport. And I personally believe that that is a very good thing. It's a very exciting weekend for the film itself, and it's cool for the sport to be highlighted on this grand stage. Of course, because this was a race weekend, we didn't get any F1 drivers actually at the Oscars, which kind of is a bummer. And of course, Lewis Hamilton was a producer on the film. One thing that is worth pointing out if you don't know much about the Oscars is that Lewis Hamilton personally is not an Oscar winner. I did see this getting bandied about where people were kind of saying that like at the end of the race weekend, he could be an Oscar winner and a race winner, and that he ended up with a podium and an Oscar in the same weekend. But sound design is not a category that Lewis would have received the Oscar for as a producer of the film. Lewis did get mentioned at the Oscars, and of course this was a big topic of conversation, but for Lewis to be considered an Oscar winner, they would have actually had to have won Best Picture. That being said, it was pretty cool to see F1 mentioned on this kind of global pop culture stage, to see the work of the sound designers of this film, of which was like very impressive work, really celebrated and praised by Hollywood, and to see what the win does for this sport in terms of a new fan base. How many more people go to watch the movie, as it is highlighted on Apple TV first and foremost today, having been an Oscar winner, and watch that film and then of course end up finding out that Formula One is a real sport that they can watch and get into. To me, scripted content is one of the best ways to bring people into a sport as a whole. to get people excited about it, and to really just kind of expand the version of who knows what Formula One is. And while Lewis didn't technically win an Oscar, he did find his way onto the podium for the first time in Ferrari red. While the Oscars were going on, we of course had a race going on at the track. F1 Academy had their season debut this weekend, and if you're new to F1 Academy, a couple of drivers that I'm personally tracking include Alicia Palmowski, who is driving for Red Bull. This is her second year in the series, and she had a very strong showing last season as her rookie debut. Additionally, we have Albahara Larson, who is the driver for Ferrari, and last year in her rookie debut drove for Tommy Hilfiger. Alba is quite young and quite talented and has kind of moved through these ranks very quickly, and I think she'll definitely be one to watch this season. One thing we did notice is that it seems like the champion from last season, Doriane Penn, is actually not moving forward in single-seaters, but instead returning to endurance racing. I was a little surprised to see this, as it has seemed like the intention behind F1 Academy is to have graduates and champions move up the ladder of single-seaters, not move outside of single-seaters. And while she does stay on as a development driver for Mercedes, we don't really see her moving forward in single-seaters themselves. The only drivers that we're currently seeing from the F1 Academy graduate class, they're still noticeably in single-seaters and moving forward, include Bianca Bustamante, who's currently competing in Euro Cup 3, and Abby Pulling, who's doing her second season in GB3. We have seen drivers continue to have relationships with Formula E, but our previous champion does not seem to be racing full-time in single-seaters. However, we did have a number of drivers debut this weekend as rookies that were exciting to watch. Personally, I was excited to see Peyton Westcott, who was the new driver for Mercedes this season, but was also the wildcard driver in Las Vegas last season. I had a chance to interview her in Vegas, and honestly, she has such a good head on her shoulders and is so locked in. I'm very excited to see how she does this season and to see the progression of wildcard drivers continuing to come in for full-time seats moving forward. But let's get into the Formula One of it all. This weekend was the first sprint race weekend that we've had all season, and of course, another dominant one for Mercedes. However, this race weekend was also a very chaotic one when it came to reliability, cars getting started, and cars actually finishing the race. When it came to sprint qualifying, I honestly thought like McLaren was doing a lot better, with the top spots getting dominated once again by Mercedes, with George taking pole and Kimi right behind him in second. But Lando Norris found himself in third, and Oscar Piastri split the Ferraris. For a moment, it kind of looked like in this sprint race qualifying, at the very bare minimum, that not only were we going to continue to see Ferrari climb up the ranks, starting to threaten Mercedes or at least get the closest to them, but that it was possible that the reigning world champions at McLaren might have figured out what was wrong last weekend and actually caught another dog into the fight. However, that was quickly debunked as we got into the race itself. A couple of notable things from the sprint specifically. We saw Kimi Antonelli have trouble with his start again here, which did make me nervous for the rest of the weekend. However, what we ended up finding out was that it was actually because Kimi was in the wrong mode at the start, which kept the car from being in the position that it needed to be to get off the line cleanly. And of course, those extra modes, this battery situation, has really become the star of this season in a horrible way. While both McLarens did finish the sprint, both of the Ferraris ended up passing both of the McLarens. George ran away with it with another sprint win, and we saw our first double podium for Ferrari in the season as a whole. Now, the sprint was a little odd because the safety car did allow us to have a pit stop, which is very uncommon when it comes to a sprint race. But this was because we did see throughout the entire weekend that the front left tire was having an extreme amount of degradation, and this gave them an opportunity to actually swap those tires out and hopefully have a better race all the way through. With that, we of course had 3 cars not finish the race and DNF. Those were Nico Hülkenberg, Valtteri Bottas, and Arvid Lindblad. And that means in the sprint itself, we had 3 different teams have 1 car not be able to finish this race. Unfortunately, we all do need to buckle up for a number of races where we continue to have these reliability issues. And that is going to make these race weekends feel a lot more chaotic. That may be a good thing if that's what you enjoy when you're watching, or that could be a bad thing if you're the type of person who wants to watch the best of the best compete and see every car cross the finish line. The sprint itself was obviously very quick, as all of these races have started to be, showed a little bit of chaos, and just gave us a small preview of everything that was about to happen in the race itself. Now, when we look at the race, I actually watched this race in a bar full of people, which was very fun, and I will say I think I enjoyed the race more simply because of that. I really am still not sold on the battery power, the boost and the overtake mode, and also sort of the yo-yo racing that we're going to have for a while. While I feel like we had a little bit less of it, we also had a lot more of someone just in the clean air running away with the race. And most of the time for these races, I'm watching them either just with my dad or by myself late night, especially like curled up on my couch. And I do think that this kind of made me feel a little bit more excited about the race than I would have had I been watching in my normal solo environment. But the thing that I was the most excited about was, of course, Kimi Antonelli taking his first race win. Kimi not only took pole position, but he also took his first Grand Prix win, and taking that pole position made him the youngest ever pole sitter for a Grand Prix. And that was less than a year after he became the youngest pole sitter in any format when he took the pole position at the Miami Grand Prix for the sprint race. If you're new to me and my content in general, you may not know that I actually interviewed Toto Wolff the weekend that Kimi took that pole position. You can see that interview on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And I actually had a lot of fun looking back on that interview and the answers and the excitement that Toto had kind of talking about Kimi Antonelli at this early point in his career. And we're really not even that far past it. That was just in May of last year. One of the things that Toto and I talked about was this idea of how many people doubted the possibility that Kimi was ready for this, that he was too young and that he was taking over, of course, Lewis Hamilton's seat. Trying to fill that gap would be this huge amount of pressure on such a young kid. Kimi Antonelli was not only very young, but he had also skipped F3 and was only in his first year at F2. And it's genuinely worth pointing out that he actually had a pretty good season last year. If you watched Drive to Survive and you kind of like got your brain twisted a little bit by the version that they portrayed there, a lot of Kimi's problems in the second half of the season were not necessarily his fault. Some were technical issues, some were other drivers crashing into him. And Kimi in general made mistakes last season as a rookie, but overall had a pretty solid season. The conversation of Rookie of the Year was between him and Isack Hadjar, who ultimately did take the award. But Kimi really did have a very strong debut in a very tough position of taking a full power car at a front level team and competing from start to finish without getting to sit in a lower level car and really learn the ropes of Formula One. Kimi got thrown into the deep end and did a great job, and now just in his second race of his second season has taken home a Grand Prix win. It's worth noting that during qualifying we have been seeing him drive ahead of George to give him a little bit of a tow, and the first time that was broken given that George's car broke down, and ultimately they almost weren't able to get him back out for the rest of Q3. Kimi Antonelli takes pole position and George was not able to match his time or exceed it. With Kimi on pole position, even with not a perfect start, Kimi was able to stay ahead of George, who joined him on the front line, and take that race win home with a pretty strong gap. One of the things I personally loved after that radio message was Toto Wolff kind of talking about how everyone doubted this decision to put Kimi in that seat, and specifically that he should have been put in a lower level seat to practice before being moved up to Mercedes. And of course, it does feel like he jumped in, and I think if we go back to old episodes of me kind of talking about that decision and seeing him take over that seat for Lewis Hamilton, I'm sure I said that I thought it was too much, too fast, and too soon. But there is a high level of spotting this talent and understanding where Kimi was that I actually believe really means that he will be a world champion and that it could be this year. There are a ton of factors that go into that, one of those factors being his own teammate, George Russell, the idea that this car has to change by the summer and that they may lose their competitive advantage, but I believe Kimi really has the mettle to do this. Kimi could win this championship this year and could be a very, very young world drivers champion in only his second season. Plus, personally watching Kimi talk after he won the race, wiping his eyes, acknowledge his mistakes where he almost crashed the car and say he almost gave himself a heart attack, seeing him fly home to Bologna to go see his mom and to kind of be around his hometown after making this giant win, having massive stars like Yannick Sinner talking about the fact that he had just done this. There are so many people that Kimi represents in a way that is very strong and beautiful, and I think it's hard not to want to root for him to be able to do that. So for me, Kimi Antonelli, especially after this weekend, but beforehand, is really my choice for World Drivers Champion this season if I could have anything exactly the way that I wanted it. Now, when we talk about reliability, this weekend was an absolute disaster. In addition to George's car kind of sputtering out on track during qualifying, and 3 cars not finishing the race during the sprint, only 15 cars actually crossed the finish line at the Grand Prix this weekend. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri weren't even able to start the race. McLaren cited 2 different technical issues when it came to their cars, one of which was with the battery, which they were unable to swap and get the car back on track. Our third car not to even start the race was Alex Albon at Williams, which has just been a disaster. Williams is actually the team that started developing their car first and seems to be having some of the worst luck when it comes to the car actually performing. And we also had Gabriel Bortoleto unable to start the race. This again was another reliability issue, which is the second weekend in a row that we've seen the same thing happen for Audi. And then we had 3 DNFs at this Grand Prix, including both of the Aston Martins, with Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso not being able to complete the race, and that is something that we know is going to continue to happen weekend after weekend with this team. And most devastatingly, Max Verstappen had to retire the car. And this is just an unfortunate reality that we're going to deal with when we have regulation changes. As these teams try to figure out how to maintain kind of the reliability of the hybrid engines, we are also going to see these teams be unable to finish races. And it does suck. It is one of my least favorite parts of a regulation change when it comes to Formula One. And it does also provide a level of chaos to these races that are going to be a lot more things like having to plan ahead and factor in safety cars. We'll continue to see a number of teams kind of expect that there will be a safety car when it comes to pit strategy. And I think just in general, it's going to be interesting to see which teams are not only able to kind of win the regulation changes at the top, like we've seen with Mercedes, but which teams will also be able to bring upgrade packages the quickest and find that new reliability as teams continue to struggle. I personally don't believe that Mercedes will maintain this intense advantage, especially as we're already seeing Ferrari kind of cut into it. And especially given the fact that we not only saw a Mercedes engine stop with George, but that other teams that are utilizing a Mercedes power unit are having trouble like McLaren. So with all of that being said, I do want to get into our main story from this race weekend, which was the way that the 2 Ferrari drivers handled their race. race, and whether or not Formula One can truly function with two different championships, one that requires two drivers to work as a team, and one that requires those same two drivers to fight against each other for an individual title. Formula One famously has two championships, the Constructors' Championship and the World Drivers' Championship. And when we look at the Constructors' Championship, this is where really all of the value to a team actually comes from. The Constructors' Championship standings at the end of the season are what determines who receives how much of the prize fund at the end of the season. It's also what determines where your garage sits, and of course, this is the main kind of championship that everyone is trying to win. The World Drivers' Championship, by contrast, does not come with any financial prize. While drivers do receive financial benefits in their contract, and no team wants to win one championship without winning the other, there really, technically speaking, is nothing that comes from a World Drivers title other than bragging rights for that driver. And it does cause one of the weirdest issues in Formula One, which is the fact that every team has two drivers on the grid, and that their points are added up together for the Constructors' Championship title, which means that in theory, in any sort of team game, you would want to have those two drivers working together to maximize the number of points that they're scoring in a single race weekend and an entire season. And sometimes that means one driver might have to sacrifice their personal win for a team win. And that is where things get complicated. Because while there's no financial benefit for the team for winning World Drivers' Championship, no driver on the grid wants to come second to their teammate, whether that's to win the championship or just in the championship standing. That is where this idea of prioritized drivers and fighting on track comes from, but it also is what causes a number of strategic errors when it comes to the drivers themselves on track. And one of the ways this was really exemplified this race weekend was with the Ferrari drivers. Now, Ferrari has really been kind of surprisingly competitive with Mercedes these past two weekends. Lewis Hamilton ended up with his first podium with Ferrari this weekend in China, finishing third. And we saw both Ferrari drivers stand on the podium in second and third when we looked at the sprint race. Ferrari seems to be, over the last two weekends, the only team that is really threatening Mercedes or even getting close to them. However, a lot of the passing that we saw this weekend was from Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc battling with each other, which also ended up with George Russell passing both of them. And as we were watching Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc go back and forth battling each other and using this yo-yo battery mode, all I could see was how much the gap that George had behind them was closing and how much the gap that Kimi had ahead of them was opening. In all of this time battling with their own teammate, what we ended up seeing was that Mercedes was the winner of that battle. Instead of having a chance to have either a race win in passing Kimi, having a chance for a strong driver who was much more of a veteran driver with either Charles Leclerc or Lewis Hamilton, both of which have much more experience on track than Kimi Antonelli does, being able to put pressure on him even if Kimi had the stronger car, there was a possibility of that gap being smaller and of Kimi under pressure making a mistake, especially given the fact that as much as I love Kimi Antonelli and I was very proud of him this race, he actually made a mistake completely on his own where he lost control of the car and almost went off track. Where towards the end of the race, while he had this finish kind of completely locked in and this race win was definitely his, he lost over a second going off track and having a little bit of a wobble, which implies there was a possibility had either of these Ferraris been able to stay up against the back of Kimi's car, they could have forced an error themselves. Instead, what we get is both of them battling with each other and spending a lot of time going back and forth, changing those positions, and ultimately letting George through. Instead of getting a double podium at bare minimum with second and third for Ferrari and holding George to fourth, we end up having George make it through and maintain his own personal standings in the World Drivers' Championship. And it brings up an interesting question when it comes to Formula One. Should drivers focus on their own personal stats when it comes to the competition, and especially with their teammates, or should they be thinking all the time about the long game and the team game? Because in this instance, it resulted in Mercedes, their direct competitor, widening their lead against them when they could have potentially fought to close that lead. Should there be moments where drivers are expected to maintain those positions as teammates and not to get into a back and forth battle like that when it could potentially cause problems for the team as a whole? Should they have to wait potentially until they're able to widen that gap with George or close down that gap with Kimi? Or should they have free reign to do what Lewis and Charles did, which is fight and go back and forth even if it costs them a position? The trouble is, this is something that comes up inherently no matter what every single season. Whatever team is doing the best in the standings also has a trouble between the two drivers that want to be World Drivers' Champion. And it's something that becomes an inherent conflict in this sport regardless, given the fact that there are two championships that are just frankly diametrically opposed. For me personally, when we look at something like this, I do feel like two drivers as senior as Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton should know that by fighting, they're opening up that gap to a driver who has a much stronger car than them. And in theory, it would be nice to see two drivers be able to work as a team and then battle it out individually towards the end of the race. Unfortunately, the timing of when this battle happened at the part of the race that it happened at meant that very quickly and very early on, they allowed George to pass them and have a ton of time to be able to build a gap and just run away with it. Whereas had had they spent some time not kind of degrading their own tires fighting with each other and also focusing on opening up that gap and then building up a gap where they could have fought each other for that second and third position kind of layout without opening up a position for Mercedes to take extra points off the board. I think that would have been a better situation for me personally in terms of the big picture. But I also think it's impossible to ask a Formula One driver who should be competitive within an inch of their life to lay off and kind of play the team game. It's an interesting situation when it comes to Formula One that I think is actually just completely insurmountable. The only way to get rid of this issue would be to get rid of the world driver's title, which of course we wouldn't do. But regardless, I think it's kind of disappointing, and it is something that's going to set up a big issue when it comes to Ferrari in general, because with Mercedes, they were able to capitalize on that fighting between two drivers and build a bigger gap before they have to change their engine. And with both races in April being canceled, there are 2 less races on the calendar that Mercedes has that have the kind of advantage from their power unit before they have to change it per the FIA. And so it does feel much more crucial for them to have been able to hold those points off of Mercedes. Personally, it is an interesting dynamic because I also think that the sport itself is very individualistic, not only in the drivers themselves, but also in the fan base. When I ask people whether they have a favorite driver or team in the sport, I'm almost always given the answer of an individual driver's name rather than a team name. Usually we get an individual driver's name and then a team name, or sometimes someone will say, I'm a McLaren fan, but only of Lando Norris, or I'm a McLaren fan, but I'm mostly an Oscar Piastri fan. Because there are so few people on the grid, only 22 drivers as a whole, it's a lot easier to connect with drivers as individuals. Even when we talk about things like the Apple Music playlist, it's something that you wouldn't be able to do with the entirety of the NFL from start to finish unless you were literally putting out multiple playlists a day. This sport is small enough that you actually could have an individual connection with each driver and understand something about them personally. You can have a personal opinion on every single one of the 22 drivers that are on this grid, which also means the competition itself is a lot more interesting to root for when you are rooting for an individual. However, another type of team sport would never be able to maintain this kind of individual competition without causing massive problems. Imagine if for basketball in the NBA or the WNBA, basketball players were not only competing to win the game as a team, but also competing individually with each of their teammates to win a secondary trophy that came with no money. You could also argue that that is like called an MVP trophy, but I'm talking about this in the sense that we're talking about an entire season and a secondary championship. There are not really team sports outside of motorsports that come with an individual championship and a team championship that are completely diametrically opposed. And with that, Formula One has a really unique problem that gets exemplified in moments like this where we had Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton battling, which ultimately cost the team overall points and arguably both of these drivers. And personally, I think it's a balance that has to be found. You have to find a way in your team to decide what certain moments mean that you should be able to battle, what moments are worth sacrificing points and what moments aren't, and how you can find a way to compete individually while still working and playing the team game. And it will be interesting to see with Ferrari and Mercedes in particular to see how that team versus individual game grows. Because with Ferrari, we have 2 very different personalities, but 2 very strong drivers who very much believe they could be world champion. With Charles Leclerc, it's a dream that he has had for a very long time that always feels just out of reach. With Lewis, it's a comeback story of a driver who has 7 world titles and wants that 8th before he retires, and desperately wants to put this sort of narrative button on the end of his career of taking home a championship with Ferrari in red. And with Mercedes, especially with Kimi winning this race, we have a very similar situation that may start to bloom, which is that George Russell very much was perceived to be the favorite heading into this season. He would be perceived to be the senior driver and also the prioritized driver, as we've been seeing in qualifying as well. But now that Kimi has had a chance to stand on his own 2 feet and show what he can do, they're tied for Grand Prix wins. What does the decision look like when George looks at a rookie teenager not just as the second driver, but as direct competition? Do we start to see some changes in the way that everyone behaves on track? And does Kimi have what it takes to stand up for himself and try to take that first driver's seat? As we go into this season with so many reliability issues, with so many things going wrong, and with so many upgrade packages and changes that will have to be made throughout, I really believe that a lot of the excitement is going to come from intra-teammate drama. And a lot of that is going to come from Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc and George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. My personal bold take and prediction, and more just kind of wish and hope, is that I think Kimi Antonelli may surprise all of us and be the one that takes it all. Again, this is a big prediction and we're only 2 races into the season, and probably just more personal desire and wishful thinking than anything else. But as we stand right now, those 4 drivers are really the ones to watch. And the question when it comes to constructors or the chance for anybody else to sneak by will really be whether or not they're playing the team game, or if these drivers compete against their teammates directly in a way that allows somebody else to kind of sneak through, which was something that we saw with McLaren last year with Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, and Max Verstappen. happen. There was never a reason why Max should have gotten that close to either of those drivers, and all of it came from the individual competition with each other. So with that being said, one of the biggest questions will be how the team principals and the teams as a whole manage their drivers, and how they manage those direct competitions with each other as they fight for constructors. When do we decide which driver is being prioritized? How do we make that a fair decision? And when do team orders start to come into play? All of these topics and questions are things that I'm very excited to break down as we go through the rest of the season. And while we don't have a race weekend next weekend, we will be doing a special episode of Grid Chat where we talk about a lot of the fictional television shows, movies, and projects that are being put into development by F1 to bring new fans into the sport through media, which is exactly my favorite type of crossover. So be sure to subscribe wherever you are listening now. Be sure to go back and watch that interview that I did with Toto Wolff back in May, and you can find me and that interview on all social media platforms, including YouTube at Marissa Kamari. And of course, be sure to join our Discord server to watch the races alongside other people just like yourself by clicking the link in the episode description down below. I will see you next week to talk all things F1 the movie and F1 media, a little bit of sports romance, and how F1 drivers are being turned into Hollywood stars. Thanks for listening to the Chinese Grand Prix recap, and I will see you next week.